Welcome to At Least You Heard It Here, with your host, former federal prosecutor, Alyse Adamson. Take it away, Alyse.
Welcome to another episode of At Least You Heard It Here. I'm your host, Alyse Adamson, and this is the podcast where we put the topic of the day on trial. And today's topic is a trial. It's the trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs, the music mogul who is now facing serious sex trafficking charges. And just as a recount, Combs is charged with 5 counts: 1 racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, the sex trafficking charge alone carries a mandatory minimum of 15 years, and if convicted on all counts, he could be looking at life in prison. That's a huge downgrade from the lavish lifestyle Combs is accustomed to. And here to break it all down and to discuss more generally whether these charges should have been brought in the first place is a good friend of mine, Bianca Forde. Bianca is a former federal prosecutor. She is a current corporate executive, and she's also an author. Her book, Prosecuted Prosecutor, a memoir and a blueprint for prosecuted criminal justice reform, is available on Amazon, and I suggest all of you check it out after this podcast. And I'm just very happy to have her here today. So welcome, Bianca. Thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Alyse, and congrats on launching your podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And coincidentally, we have this giant trial that we have to cover, right? This is crazy. Right. Before we get into the discussion about whether or not they should have brought charges at all, because I think that's a question a lot of us in the legal community have been kind of discussing amongst ourselves, you were actually at the trial yesterday. Is that right?
I was. I happened to be in New York, and I decided I would take a chance and see if I could get into the courtroom. And while I missed the courtroom by about 2 people, because there are occupancy capacity limits, I was able to get into overflow, which was still a win because this is a trial that's not being televised, right? So the only way you can see it play by play is either to be in the main courtroom or in overflow. So I did have a chance to sit and watch it on a TV, see the exhibits come up, hear the witnesses, particularly Ms. Rashards and a part of Ms. Morgan's testimony, as well as the motion in limine proceeding that happened before testimony began.
This is how I know you're a former federal prosecutor and you're a rule follower, because please believe I would have found a way to sneak into the actual courtroom. You missed it by 2 people. Heartbreaking.
Missed it by 2 people.
But no,
it's an aside, but in part because people were not following rules. People were cutting. Okay. And it's very disrespectful to the time of those who were in line at 5:30 and 6 a.m. But that's where we landed.
So what did you observe at your time at the trial yesterday? So Don Rashards was still on the stand. At the time of this recording, we're only in the 2nd week of trial, and the government has offered some of their main witnesses very early on. I know with Cassies, it was a timing issue because she's about to give birth. Don Rashards probably followed her because it directly corroborated her testimony, but these are kind of critical witnesses for the government's case. Is that correct? And my understanding from the reporting, again, I was not lucky enough to be there, is that Don had an uneven performance. What do you think?
I think uneven could potentially be an understatement.
Wow.
Dawn was an interesting witness. There were moments when I wondered why she was there, particularly it's early in the trial. I don't think you can actually determine her value add until you know the extent, the full gamut of the government's case. I will say that she did a good job of placing various members of the enterprise, within the zone of where things happened, whether it was the abuse of Ms. Ventura or the threats that the defendant allegedly made against Ms. Rashards and others. She did a really good job of putting people in the room, like D-Rock and other security guards like Bonds, right? People whose names keep coming up, she was able to put them in the room. But there were a number of inconsistencies that Nicole West Morland, she just performed. Classic cross.
And who's that? Who's just for our viewers?
Yeah, she is one of Sean Combs' attorneys, and she did a phenomenal job on cross-examination of Ms. Rashards.
And just tell us, what's the significance of Don Rashards putting all these people in the room? Why does the government want that evidence out there?
Yeah, so the government has charged this case under RICO. And that means that a big portion of the bad act had to have been conducted through the enterprise, which is Bad Boy Entertainment and a variety of other companies that Sean Combs owns. Under RICO, the defendant and the enterprise cannot be the same. So if they're going to charge the defendant, they have to prove his bad acts through an enterprise. And in order for an enterprise to act, right, there must be coordination. There must be coordination of people. And that is central to the RICO case that the government is attempting to prove here. So in order to do that, they have to bring in members of the enterprise, and those people are going to be none other than the defendant's employees through the various enterprises and organizations that he owns.
So you mentioned the cross. You said Nicole West Morland, who is Diddy's attorney, did, I guess, an effective job. What did she do that impressed you as a former prosecutor?
Sure. Well, she set up the prior and consistent statements really well. It was sort of your classic cross-examination 101, particularly in this case because Don Rashards has met with the prosecution 8 times. And on this issue of whether or not Mr. Combs threatened Ms. Rashards in the presence of others. And by the way, Nicole West Morland also established that there was no point during any of the conduct that Ms. Rashards testified about that she was one-on-one solo with Mr. Combs. At every given point, there was someone there. And I think they are setting up Miss Harper to be a defense witness, but that's a whole other point there. I really do believe that Miss Westmoreland established a classic cross-examination by saying things such as, you spoke to the prosecution about this topic before. Yes. And when you spoke to the prosecution, the defendant wasn't in the room, correct? Yes. I wasn't in the room, correct? Yes. None of Mr. Combs' attorneys were in the room, right? You felt safe. Yes. And you did not mention that Mr. Combs previously threatened that you would go missing if you said what you'd seen about Miss Ventura. And in each instance, Ms. Rashards essentially said, I testified to the best that I shared what I could remember at the time to the best of my ability, right? But unfortunately, she used words like, I tell my stories as best as I can at the time. And you know that as a lawyer, you don't ever want a witness to refer to their statement as a story, right? That ultimately just lends.
It's the truth,
right? There was even a point where Miss Morland said, and you have to agree with me that your story has changed multiple times during the course of this investigation. And Miss Rashards answered yes in the affirmative, right? So those are really strong points to add to her or to take away from her credibility that really bolsters the defense's case.
That sounds like it was a blistering cross. Did the prosecution seem bothered? Did they understand that this was not going well for them?
I think, from my vantage point, I could not see facial expressions or reactions or anything like that. From the rehabilitation, I think the prosecution did feel as though they'd taken a couple of hits there. I will say that another area that came out in the cross was bias, right? And we know that bias is always up. It's always relevant. And there were a couple of instances where Miss Westmoreland really detracted from what Ms. Rashards said. For instance, she indicated, she established on cross that Ms. Rashards actually attempted, after leaving Bad Boy in 2011, she tried to go back, right? It couldn't have been that bad if you wanted to go back. And as recently as 20 and 21, Ms. Rashards reached out, initiated contact with Mr. Combs to get back, to get the band back together. Diddy Dirty Money, which I admit I'd never heard about, but she was involved in after Danity Kane. And on direct, she mentioned that she reached out to Mr. Combs because she wanted to get in touch with a judge. This was actually redirect. This was part of the rehabilitation. And the defense was able to get back up and say, you expect us to believe that you reached out to Mr. Combs to get Diddy Dirty Money back together just so you could have contact with this judge for the course of your career, when you know if you get this band back together, you'll be spending a lot of time with Mr. Combs, right? Hotel rooms, right? Yes. I'm going on tours, 60, 70 cities at a time, correct? Yes. It was like really, really devastating. There was also this fascinating line of questioning. And I actually took some notes on it because I want to get it right. I want to get it verbatim for you all. Ms. Westmoreland said, you believe that Mr. Combs ruined your career not once, but twice, right? With Danity Kane and dismantling Dirty Money. And Ms. Rashards said yes. And she said, music is your dream. Yes. And you've been trying to be successful at it for a while, correct? Ms. Rashards, yes. I have been successful at it, she said. And then the defense attorney said, in the past? And she's like, no, now. And it was this sort of really tense moment where you could see Ms. Rashards was fighting for her success, right? And just a really interesting moment to observe in the course of this trial.
Yeah, if she was so successful, then why is she begging to get back on dirty money? And I mean, let's be honest, I've never heard of it either. And I would love to see some folks comment and tell me if they have heard of dirty money before this trial started. We've all heard of Danity Kane. I mean, I think
Yeah.
they were the band that was formed on the TV show Making the Band,
Yeah.
also questionable of whether that was a real music group or not. So, I guess that was effective, Cross, because what I'm thinking as I'm hearing you talk is she's motivated by money and success. She wanted to get back in Combs's good graces, even knowing that he's violent, because I don't think it's in dispute that this man is violent. I mean, the defense
Absolutely not.
conceded that in their opening statement.
Yeah.
She wanted to be famous. And I think that's kind of central to the defense's arguments here, that these folks were involved with Combs, as despicable and violent and, quite frankly, criminal as he is, because they got something out of it, right? They got a benefit, which is
Yeah.
proximity to fame, money, what have you. And so that kind of lends itself to my next question, which is, should they have brought this case at all? I've had an opportunity to speak to a lot of legal minds about this case, and the consensus is kind of like some of it might be overreach, like prosecutors might be able to prove this case, but if his name wasn't P. Diddy, they might not have brought it. And so what do you think of that, especially given what you saw with a witness who was taken down so badly? I mean, you usually know who's going to be a good witness and who's going to be a bad witness, and you don't usually sponsor vulnerable witnesses like that who aren't going to stand up on cross. And it seems like the government felt like they needed to get some of her testimony out. So should they have brought a case when they're hinging, the linchpin of the charges depend on some of these witnesses that really do have some exploitable bias?
Look, I think that it's early, right? We don't know what the rest of the what the rest of the government's case looks like. We don't know who the rest of their witnesses are, what they're going to say, whether they're vulnerable or not. Although I would argue that every witness I've ever seen has had some level of vulnerability. It's just the extent of how big that vulnerability is. Should they have brought a case? I think that I didn't get to see Miss Ventura's testimony, but if it is anywhere near as compelling as her civil complaint was, then they absolutely should have brought this case, right? Everything that I've read talks about how credible and how compelling and convincing Miss Ventura was as a witness. And I think, having not heard her testimony, I imagine that a lot of the allegations, right, the way they're written, because her civil complaint is essentially alleging human trafficking as well, right? So I'd imagine that there was a lot of overlap between what she has said in her civil complaint and what came out at trial last week when she testified. And if that is the case, I don't think that the government overreached by charging Sean Combs with human trafficking. I do think there's a question of whether or not they're going to be able to convince a jury of 12 that Mr. Combs and Bad Boy Entertainment, right, was used as an enterprise, a RICO enterprise through which to conduct, amongst other things, human trafficking.
For the RICO charge, they put in their indictment, which is the formal charging document, a bunch of these bad acts, like these criminal things that they allege Bad Boy and the other entities did. Like, it isn't just the trafficking. It's also bribery. They said they bribe people not to talk. It's obstruction. It's arson. So it's not just the freak offs. I think, again, the freak offs are central because they're also saying that the enterprise was really acting to satisfy Sean Combs' sexual gratification, and there's the human trafficking, but there's also these other bad acts that the government needs to show, and I believe that they have to prove at least two of, they call them predicate offenses, to convict on a RICO charge. So again, it is early. I haven't heard a lot of testimony that would support, or if any testimony that would support those charges. Again, I'm not in the courtroom, so I'm relying very heavily on our real-time reporters, both on network television and then also our friends on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X. It will always be Twitter to me. But what do you think? If they're able to establish some of these other bad acts, do you think that makes a more compelling RICO case, or do you think it really rises and falls on this sex trafficking?
I don't think predicate acts are their problem, right? I think there was a lot of activity, including some of you mentioned, the bribery, the obstruction, et cetera. I think the problem is whether or not the individuals who helped Sean Combs take these actions were passive actors versus directing criminal activities, right? Part of RICO is about joint purpose. And as you mentioned in one of your recent episodes, when you think about the statutory history of RICO, a big part of it was to get the guy at the top, right? Because it was easy to get the little guys, but harder to get the guy at the top of the food chain or the girl. In this case, you don't need RICO to get Sean Combs. He is literally in the middle of all of it. He's in the thick of all of it, whether it's through text messaging, the testimony that we've already heard, the eyewitness testimony. I don't think you need RICO for that. And I think that there's a potential vulnerability in the fact that so many of the individuals who are named have participated in this RICO enterprise as employees of Sean Combs were following his direction, right? A lot of the statements that I walked in that the judge was ruling on in connection to in the motion in limine were statements of Sean Combs employees through Bad Boy and other entities, and whether or not they could come into evidence. And one of the things the defense mentioned was, we are creating a bad act free for all, right? If everything they say can come in, we are basically being overbroad. There's overbreath here in terms of what we will hear, and we are creating an excessively prejudicial environment. And while the government needs to get those statements in to show the level of conspiracy and coordination that's required under RICO, many of the statements that were at issue were still facilitation statements, right? They didn't indicate a directing the criminal activity. Yeah, they might have a directorship role over Bad Boy, but selling records versus directing criminal human trafficking are two very different things. So I think the jury might grapple a bit. It might be difficult for the jury to really see the enterprise as being used to conduct these activities. That's where I think the vulnerability is.
The conversation surrounding Cassie is really, can the government prove it? They're saying that she was doing this weekly for 3 to 4 days at a time over the course of a decade. And I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it just does not sound like something somebody would want to do that frequently. Yeah. She was degraded, awful, right? And juries get to use their common sense. You get to ask yourself, would a person really want to engage in that kind of behavior at that frequency for that long? Because again, the defense did a good job painting her as in love with Combs, willing to do what he said because she was essentially his girlfriend and wanting to become his wife. And so they're trying to confuse the jury. And that's why I think their strategy in the opening statement was smart. They called him a jerk. They said Sean Combs did commit criminal acts, and they knew when they said that he couldn't be prosecuted for the acts that they conceded to, because there was no way, to your point, given what Cassie was saying, that they could cast any doubt on the conduct itself, sure. Right? It had to be both Combs' intent and then also Cassie's consent. And while I think the cross was effective, bringing out the very complicated parts of this relationship, Cassie did admit that she was in love with him. I also agree with you that she's a victim. And I think she is also a victim of trafficking, because even if she didn't communicate it clearly, and I think I need to go back and read the details of the testimony more carefully, because I'm not sure how she said no, but I do think that there has been enough evidence elicited just from her to demonstrate that she was not a willing participant. But we both know from being in trial, defense counsel is very cunning, and they can take her answers. And then also the bombshell at the end of that recross that she's being paid $10 million from the Intercontinental Hotel, and they can cast doubt. And what they say, it only takes one to hang, right? That means
bombshell. I don't understand why that's a bombshell, right? I mean, the hotel willingly took $50,000 of cash from Sean Combs, right, to suppress this video that, had it come out sooner, the public, right, and the prosecution would have been more aware of what had been going on in the world of Bad Boy Entertainment and the life of Sean Combs. I don't understand what accepting $10 million, what impact that has at all on this case against Sean Combs on a criminal level.
Listen, I agree with you. I think what happened there was that the government was not prepared for that question.
Oh, the government did not bring it out in direct.
The government did not bring it out in direct. They brought out the $20 million settlement with Combs, but they didn't bring out the $10 million. And because they didn't, Cassie was not as prepared to answer the question. So I think it made her seem a little bit defensive, but really what it was that she was caught off guard. But look, as I have said many times, there is no problem with her getting paid here. I mean, we are in a litigious society. He caused harm. That's what civil suits are there to do, right? They are to make you financially whole. And the Intercontinental Hotel, to your point, they did not act appropriately.
Yeah.
That's crazy. They watched a young woman get beaten, and then a man brought them a bag of cash, and they let it go.
And let's talk about that for a second, because this is a good example of enterprise liability. Now, it's not RICO, but it's enterprise liability. Some individual at Intercontinental Hotel took $50,000. I don't know who it is. I don't know that person's name. I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but an individual took $50,000 and suppressed that video. Didn't delete it, obviously, but suppressed it in some way, was probably holding on to it for another personal payday. But I digress. But the point is, it is IHG that was just responsible for paying $10 million because an organization can only act through its people, right? IHG.com can't commit a crime unless there's someone within that entity that is actually perpetrating that, right? So I think that gives a really good example of what enterprise liability through RICO, although it's a little bit more complicated, it has a lot of moving parts, but essentially at its core, it's about people coming together for a common purpose to perpetuate unlawful acts.
I think we've elicited a lot of your legal analysis here. And so now it's time for closing arguments. I will start. I think that the government should have brought this case, even as a RICO. I think the government has been using the RICO statute more and more. That is how they took down R. Kelly. I think that and I do agree with everything you've said, that we haven't heard it yet. But if they get some individuals to say that they were aware of what was going on and that they were willing participants, I think the government might be able to meet their burden. And furthermore, this is why we have jury trials. The government needed to prove probable cause for the indictment, but they also needed to have a good chance of success when they brought the case to trial. This is a Southern District of New York who is prosecuting the case. They love to think of themselves as the cream of the crop of all of the U.S. Attorney's Office. As one from the U.S. Attorney's Office of D.C., I get a little sensitive about that, but SDNY is full of very elite prosecutors. I think they have something like an 85% conviction rate. So they really believed that the evidence will show a corrupt enterprise. And I think that we should leave it to those 12 jurors, if the government really believes they can meet their burden, to determine Mr. Combs' fate. That is the cornerstone of the criminal justice system. I think for all the reasons we've discussed, I think they also have enough on the trafficking. And then I also, I think the last charge, the prostitution charge, I think at this point, that's just low-hanging fruit. They've already established that they would hire prostitutes interstate, and I think they're going to get them on that. So for all of those reasons, I think the government has enough evidence to establish all of the elements beyond a reasonable doubt, and we should let a jury decide.
So, Alyse, I agree with you on some of this. I agree that the defendant is dead to rights on the prostitution, the transport for purposes of engaging in prostitution. My fundamental concern here comes with the RICO charge. In my book, Prosecuted Prosecutor, a memoir and blueprint for prosecutor-led criminal justice reform, I talk about the dangers of overreaching and how it undermines the credibility of the system as a whole. And here, the community, if Mr. Combs is acquitted of the RICO charge, the community is not going to understand the difference between failing to establish sex trafficking against Sean Combs and failing to establish sex trafficking against the bad boy enterprise and RICO liability. And I think what we do is we risk a situation where the verdict, if it is an acquittal, is misconstrued as another example of victims not being properly protected by our system. And that is the danger here of overreaching.
Bianca, thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure, reminding me back to our United States Attorney's Office days. I hope you come back and join me again. We're going to be talking about this for a long time and a lot of other things that I would love your wonderful insight into.
Thanks for having me, Alyse. This was fun.
And thanks. And for all of you, if you liked what you heard here, go ahead and click like and subscribe. And just remember to tell folks, at least you heard it here.